All right, so good evening, everybody. We're going to get started in just a second. So if you're in the chat, please just tell me if you can hear me clearly and if the audio is working fine. Okay, so I'm going to go through the questions that people sent to me on Remind before I got started here. So first of all, a few people asked me to just kind of explain the basics about a handful of the empires that we're dealing with. So we're going to start with the Persian Empire, and this is the first of the major classical empires that you need to be aware of. So their empire began based in Persia, which is now modern day Iran in the Middle East, in the early 500s BCE. And from there, they gradually expanded, actually pretty quickly, took over basically all of Mesopotamia, out to the Indus River Valley, into Egypt, into modern day Turkey, and a couple of times they tried to invade Greece and into Europe. So this was the biggest empire in the history of the world up to that point. And once again, like the main thing you need to know about these empires of the classical era is simply just what are the things that empires did in order to make themselves stronger, in order to make themselves more powerful, etc., etc. So the Persians, they were like other empires. They built big road networks, they built defensive walls around their cities, they had a big professional military system that had like the latest iron technology and steel technology. But the Persians, they also had kind of like, since they were the biggest empire, they were the first ones to really deal with a lot of like cultural diversity and like huge sort of multinational states. So they were the ones who started to act a little bit more leniently and tolerantly. Basically, they said, listen, just pay your taxes, don't rebel. You can have your own religion, you can have your own language, just whatever. Just don't rebel and be part of the empire. And pay tribute to the king once in a while. So the king in Persia, though, he sort of represented a religion called Zoroastrianism, which is one of the biggest early monotheistic traditions. And this was a religion that was all about the struggle between good and evil that eventually sort of influenced Judaism and Christianity later on. And the Persian kings always claimed that they were the ones ruling on behalf of the side of good in this universal struggle. So even when they conquered Mesopotamia and Egypt, they never like forced the religion on the people they conquered. They simply just said, listen, clearly your gods want us to rule over you as well because we're so good and we're so tolerant and, we look out for the people so much. Even your gods want us to rule. So that was their claim to divine right. Now they also had the first like standard money system across a single empire. So whether you were in Persepolis, the capital, or all the way out in Turkey, the coins would all have the king's face on them. So it was kind of a constant reminder that you were part of that empire. Now they also had this system of bureaucratic government called satraps, where there would be Persian governors sent out. So even though they let like the Egyptians have their own sort of local rulers and so on, a satrap would be sent out just to kind of keep an eye on things and have part of the army there to help them out and just make sure that Persian law was being followed and that tribute was being paid and so on. So the Persians then, they collapsed when they were conquered by Alexander the Great from Macedonia in the 300s. And they were in the middle of a civil war, so they were kind of hit at like a moment of weakness. Once again, one of the things that leads to these empires falling apart is when they have a crisis of leadership and they're sort of vulnerable to attack from outside because of just internal political disputes that are kind of ripping them apart. So even after they collapsed, though, their system was so effective that later dynasties, like the Parthians later on in the classical era, or the Sassanids even later in the classical era, who are based in Persia, will basically use the same systems and the same ideas, the same religious attitudes, but it'll just be different dynasties. So once again, all of these empires kind of do things the same way. It just kind of looks a little different each time. Now, next is the Roman Empire. So this was another one of the major classical empires, and they coexisted basically at the same time as the Han Dynasty over in China. So this was like one of the endpoints of the Silk Road. After the Silk Road would bring silk along, Central Asia and into the Middle East. Some of that silk ended up literally in the city of Rome, or in Gaul, which is modern-day France. So Rome, though, began as one single city-state in modern-day Italy. And it was kind of like the Greek city-states. It was relatively small, and the people there thought of themselves as like citizens who were free, and they had rights, and they had liberty, and all that sort of thing. And then gradually, over the course of a couple centuries, they expanded to take over all of Italy and create kind of a little empire there. Then they bounced across the Mediterranean and up into Western Europe. And then finally, by the 1st century BCE, they conquered basically all of Greece and all of Turkey, part of the Middle East and Egypt. So all of this territory that had been Persian and had been part of Alexander's empire was all brought under Roman control. And as they expanded, once again, they did the things empires do. A big technologically advanced military system, huge road network. Remember, these guys were known for their water engineering, so like the aqueducts and fountains in their cities and bathhouses. They wanted to make it clear, like, we are builders. We are people who can make life better for our people, also while having sort of strong military presence. So the first emperor of Rome, the guy who kind of like stitched the empire together under his leadership, was Augustus, Caesar Augustus. Those are two different titles that eventually would be used for basically all of the emperors later on in the empire and in the Byzantine Empire. So he's the one who kind of created this system, and for a couple hundred years it prospered, it was stable, and the bureaucratic system of government he created, where government officials from the upper classes of the Roman Empire sort of worked with local elites, kind of like in the Persian Empire. And they were very tolerant of other religious systems, and there were huge numbers of different languages all across the empire. But Latin, though, the language of the Romans themselves, became like the main language of the western part of the empire, in what's now France and Spain and Italy. But in the east, where there already was a sort of flourishing Greek and Hellenistic civilization, Greek was the language of elites out there. And the Romans, they adopted things, left and right from people they conquered. They were very sort of open and willing to just adopt and adapt things. So like the Greek mythology about their gods and goddesses, they pulled that into their own religion and started telling those stories about their own gods and goddesses. So they were a very sort of open society. Now, of course, this is the empire, though, where Christianity began, in right around Jerusalem in modern-day Israel, when it was part of the Roman Empire. So, based on the teachings of Jesus, his followers began to preach his teachings about salvation and devoting yourself to the one God. And gradually it kind of spread as an underground religion through the Eastern Empire and then eventually out to the West as well. And mainly because this empire was so sort of unified and stable, it was easy for missionaries to move across the Mediterranean and go from city to city. And you're going to see that cities and urban areas are really the places where conversion happened in the greatest numbers. So it kind of grew from the ground up in these urban communities. Now eventually, Constantine was going to be the first emperor who actually adopted Christianity himself in the 300s. And once that happened, then he organized all of the leaders of the Christian churches across the empire into this hierarchical system of bishops and priests who kind of like oversaw the religion on behalf of the state. So they kind of turned the religion from being this underground sort of decentralized thing among like the lower classes and marginalized people into a powerful state religion that supported the authority of the emperor by claiming that he was now ruling on behalf of the one God, on behalf of Jesus, and basically sort of turning it into more of a hierarchical element of their power structure. So, now, eventually, though, the Roman Empire collapsed, and in the western part of Europe, that was where you had invasions by Germanic peoples and Huns from Central Asia. And kind of like the Persians, they got caught at a moment of weakness when they were having a succession crisis. And for decades, in like the 200s, there were civil wars, and generals were fighting each other to gain control of the imperial throne. And meanwhile, all of these Germanic peoples are invading and starting to settle on land and basically claiming military control over it away from the empire. So, Constantine then, really the other thing he did that was notable, he slid the empire from Rome over to Constantinople, a city he named after himself. And when he organized the church, there were basically like these two sort of poles of power in the church. One major leader was in Rome, that eventually became the Pope of the Catholic Church. And then the other leader in Constantinople was really kind of under the authority of the emperor himself. Now, eventually then, the type of Christianity that was popular in the Byzantine Empire, where they used Greek instead of Latin as the language of the Bible and as the language of like church services and rituals, that piece of Christianity eventually became known as Orthodox Christianity. And the word Orthodox, that's a term that gets self-applied by religions who want to claim that they are like the ones who are doing it correctly. And to say something is orthodox, you're implying that like that is the proper or the correct belief or the way of doing things. So by using that particular word in their title, the Byzantine Church was claiming that they were the ones who were really doing it the right way. So now, basically then the Byzantine Empire, while it existed for hundreds more years, they kept on doing things once again the same way that the Romans had, the same way that other empires had. So a powerful centralized government, a big professional military system, and they were known for their navy especially, and their big like engineering systems and the defensive walls around the city of Constantinople, and their giant church and cathedral architecture, like here the Hagia Sophia, which was kind of the pinnacle of Byzantine architecture. This was the biggest church in the world for about 1,000 years after it was built by the Emperor Justinian in the 500s. So the system, though, where the church was directly under the authority of the state was called Caesaro-Papism. Caesar for emperor, and then papism for basically the pope. So this is kind of saying that like the emperor was the pope, was like the father, the head of the church. Now the Byzantine Empire then, even though it was a reduced form of the Roman Empire, it continued to flourish for a few hundred more years. It was still a major focal point for trade between Asia and Europe. So like once again, silks would pass through there, and eventually they started learning how to produce their own silk after that was smuggled out of China. But they also had a huge influence on Eastern Europe. So Russian civilization, as that developed, learned about Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantines, and their writing system was based on the Greek writing system in the Byzantine Empire. And the Russians eventually basically declared themselves to be the third Roman Empire after Rome and after the Byzantine Empire. And they sort of claimed that they were inheriting and continuing that civilization as a claim to their own authority. And the title Tsar, the Russian imperial title, that literally just meant Caesar in the Russian language. So the Byzantines, though, they were constantly fighting against Persian dynasties, and then when Islam began in the 600s, they began the process of really kind of swallowing up the Byzantine Empire. So Egypt was taken over by Muslim forces in the 700s, and eventually by the 1400s, all that was really left of the Byzantine Empire was the city of Constantinople, after the Ottomans had basically sort of gobbled up all the territory in Greece and Turkey around it. So, now, I got another question about the Boxer Rebellion. So this happened in China in 1899 to 1901. And the context here, during the 1800s, China had been sort of progressively weakened. The Qing Dynasty had been sort of progressively weakened by military defeats at the hands of Westerners, like the British and the French, in what were known as the Opium Wars, which, forced the Qing Dynasty to sign the unequal treaties and placed them in a position of economic and sort of political, I guess you could say second place compared to Westerners that had industrialized at that point. And the thing is, even if China wasn't like literally falling apart at that point, the Qing Dynasty kind of lost all of its authority and prestige, and the Chinese people simply just no longer really wanted to follow them. So the Taiping Rebellion later on was the first nationalist attempt to just drive out Western influence and drive out the Qing Dynasty. And it was brutally put down by the dynasty itself and by, once again, Western military forces. So 1899 then, this was kind of like the last gasp of the Qing Dynasty. And they allied themselves with a Taoist religious sect that were known by Westerners as the Boxers because of the particular form of martial arts that they did that they thought sort of gave them mystical powers and made them invincible and that sort of thing. Now, the extent to which people who were part of the Boxers or were following them really believed in the sort of Taoist mysticism, it's debatable, but they sort of represented, this kind of last gasp of traditional Chinese culture and sort of traditional Chinese civilization against modernization and against the West and industrialization. So for a couple of years then, the Qing Dynasty supported the Boxers in this attempt to once again just drive out the British, drive out the French, drive out Germans and the Japanese. Now this time, the rebellion was put down just by a coalition of Western and industrial military forces from Britain, from France, from Germany, from Japan, and the British imported soldiers from some of their other colonies like India to also fight against the Boxers. And after this rebellion was crushed, brutally crushed, now these Western powers basically told the Qing Dynasty, listen, you just tried to throw us out of your country in violation of all of our treaties, so you simply are not fit to rule this country anymore. So the last Qing emperors were literally kind of put under house arrest in the Forbidden City Palace in Beijing. And then from that point forward, China was increasingly just kind of carved up and descended into essentially just a nonstop civil war, a kind of feudal system and warlord era for the next couple of decades. So, and the Qing Dynasty was overthrown in 1911. Now, I got another question here about NATO. So, NATO, one second. All right. So, NATO is the acronym for a military alliance that was created after World War II by the United States, and it stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, it's called North Atlantic because all of the countries that were part of this alliance were around the North Atlantic. So on this map here, you can see all the countries in blue were original members of NATO when it began in 1949. Now, this alliance also included the United States and Canada as well, which clearly are not on this map. So now basically the reason why this alliance began there, when World War II ended, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin had occupied all of Eastern Europe and basically started forcing the countries in Eastern Europe to adopt communist governments that were based on the Soviet model. And, they were very repressive single-party states that were under Soviet military occupation. So the countries in Western Europe were all occupied by the United States and the British. And basically these countries, were brought under our protection, and we helped them rebuild, and we, reinstalled democratic governments and more sort of capitalist economic systems there. And basically to protect against the spread of communist power, we created this formal military alliance, where all of the countries involved in this alliance pledged to defend each other in the case of attack by Soviet or Eastern Bloc forces. And Greece and Turkey, they joined the alliance basically as like another way of surrounding and trying to contain Soviet military force. Now, like really the biggest single reason though why this alliance began is because in 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested their first nuclear weapon, which basically was like, that made them the second nuclear power in the world behind the United States. So we decided we needed to do something fast in order to kind of bolster our military strength. Now, after we created NATO, the Soviet Union took all of these countries in Eastern Europe that it controlled and basically turned that into its own counter-alliance called the Warsaw Pact. And Warsaw was the capital of Poland, which is where like the treaty was signed. So then the Cold War became this kind of showdown between NATO and the Warsaw Pact for dominance in Europe, and basically for sort of like influence around the world. Now, NATO then, it was through this lens, or through this kind of vector, that this is when the United States really became like a global superpower. So in a handful of NATO countries, we built military bases where we, in some cases, like in Italy and Germany, still have, thousands and thousands of troops and all sorts of military hardware stationed. So this is when you could kind of say that, in opposition to the Soviet Union, the United States really became a global superpower in a military sense. Now, once the Cold War ended in the 90s and the early 2000s, then all of these countries in Eastern Europe that basically like overthrew or voted out their communist governments and adopted democratic systems again, basically like the second they were free of Soviet power, most of them ended up joining NATO in order to gain our protection against the possibility of like Russia, trying to expand again into Europe. And gradually NATO has grown and grown and grown as the Soviet Union shrank and shrank and shrank. So now basically almost every country right up to the borders of Russia is part of NATO. Once again, the main sort of focus is to protect Europe from the possibility of Russian aggression at some point in the future. So now I got another question here about religious schisms, and I think this is the last question that I'm going to be answering tonight. So, don't be shocked if you see a question about pretty much all of these things. Don't be shocked if you see a question about NATO. Don't be shocked if you see questions about religious schisms. Now, the word schism means a separation, where like two branches or types of the same religion separate from each other, and the people who believe this go that way, the people who believe this go that way. So, the big ones to be aware of that. Within Christianity, there were really two major schisms that occurred. So first, after the Roman Empire declined, that's when you see the first big schism between Roman Catholicism in Western Europe, based in the city of Rome, versus Eastern Orthodox Christianity, based around Constantinople. Now, basically the situation there was that in the Byzantine Empire, the state, the actual Byzantine government remained very powerful and very centralized. So they were able to maintain control over the whole sort of hierarchy and system of religion and really kind of maintain it as part of the state. But in Western Europe, where Germanic peoples settled and carved out their little feudal kingdoms, they didn't really have control over the religion. Instead, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church basically was kind of left behind by the Romans. And in all the cities and big towns in Western Europe, the bishops and the priests within the church were really like the most powerful and influential figures, because to some extent the religion predated the Germanic warlords and was really kind of looked at as more prestigious and sort of legitimate than these warlords. So the Pope then became kind of a separate independent authority over all of the clergy, all of like the church leaders in Western Europe who were doing Christianity for Western Europe. So feudal lords found it in their interest to support the church in exchange for the church's support for them. And because of this kind of independent power, the church became hugely powerful and wealthy because it took in donations and, gifts from kings and lords that wanted its support and backup for their rule. But the Byzantine Emperor and his church authorities, they wanted to claim that they were the leaders of all Christians, and the Pope wanted to claim that he was the leader of all Christians. And ultimately, this led to a formal split, where literally, like, the leaders of both churches just kind of threw each other out and said, "You're not Christian anymore. No, you're not Christian anymore." And then this schism occurred between the two churches. Now, there were some other differences, though, too. In Western Europe, the Roman Catholic Church kept the Bible in Latin, the language of the Roman Empire. So even after people in France started speaking French, this version of Latin that had become very sort of different. And when people in England started speaking English, the church still used Latin. So that gave them, again, like another sort of special power that, normal people didn't have. The ability to read and write and understand Latin, the language of like this special knowledge that the church had. Now, both types of Christianity, though, had monasteries. You could become a monk or a nun and like go devote yourself to God there. In the Byzantine Church, though, the Eastern Orthodox Church, Greek was the language of the Bible there and all the services. But when the Orthodox Church, Lucy, off. When the Byzantine Church spread into Russia or into other parts of Eastern Europe, it actually didn't stay under Byzantine authority. And in Russia, for example, it remained under state authority, but it was under the Russian state rather than the Byzantine state. And the language they used for the Bible there and for their services was Russian. So you can see that the Orthodox Church kind of transformed itself to fit whatever kind of country it was joining or going into. So, now the next big schism in Christianity, though, was specifically within the Catholic Church. So in the 1500s, by this point, political authorities and just kind of like the people of Europe had become really kind of distrustful and critical of the Catholic Church as an authority. And, there was criticism that like the church, they were taking in all this money and they were just spending it on like palaces for the Pope, and they weren't really like doing anything useful with it or helping the poor or whatever. And the Black Death had happened and the church couldn't do anything about it. And it wasn't their fault, but this kind of like lowered their moral authority in Western Europe. So you start to see people really thinking, okay, like, let's think about this. Like, do we need the church anymore? Like, can't we just do Christianity by ourselves? So in the early 1500s, reformers like Martin Luther started to protest against the Catholic Church. And their particular Christian views became known as Protestantism. And generally speaking, Luther and other reformers like him, their main criticism of the church was that if you go back and like read the Bible, doesn't say anything about a church in there. There's nothing about a pope. There's nothing about monasteries. There's nothing about building giant cathedrals. They're like, hey, Jesus was talking about like helping the poor and the sick and like everyone's spiritually equal. And, you should just follow his teachings. So Protestants then, their version of Christianity became much more focused on like the sort of individual relationship with God and Jesus, rather than like the individual relationship to the church, which the Catholic Church was really kind of emphasizing as the most important thing in Christianity. So Protestants then, basically they swept away this whole hierarchy of the church, and they translated the Bible into languages besides Latin, so everybody could read it. And they shut down monasteries. Now, the thing is though, Protestantism only really became popular in places where it had the support of political leaders. So some kings and princes and rulers in Europe looked at this as a really good way to become more independent, to, basically tell the Pope, like, hey, I don't need to listen to you anymore, and to keep more of their money in the country rather than sending it out to the church. And if they like shut down monasteries, they could just confiscate all that land and wealth for themselves. So Protestantism then, it became popular for religious reasons because people really were critical of the church, and for political reasons by rulers who just used it as like a way to just get more power for themselves. And some parts of Europe then became Protestant. So England, that's where King Henry VIII, famously like broke away from the Catholic Church simply because he just wanted to get a divorce and have more kids. But Northern Europe, so like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany became Protestant, but Italy, Spain, France remained Catholic. And, as they sort of colonized the rest of the world, Spain and Portugal would bring the Catholic Church with them to the New World, to America, and that would become part of their state system there as a way of kind of bolstering their power. Now, to fight against Protestantism, though, the Roman Catholic Church created what was known as the Inquisition, which was, you could say, kind of like the FBI of the Catholic Church, where in countries where they allowed it to happen, where like the Spanish king allowed it to work, priests who had this special job would go investigate people who were, criticizing the church or criticizing the king. And if they were found to be doing things that were like anti-Christian or anti-Catholic, they could be tried and burned at the stake or executed or whatever. So that became a very strong tool that Catholic kings used to strengthen their rule and to make sure that everyone was kind of doing the religion the same way and be part of, that everyone was on the team with the king. So, now, also the Reformation, it was facilitated by the printing press, which actually began or was invented or was first made available in Europe in Germany, where Martin Luther actually lived and worked. So basically, once he started to print his ideas in book form, and once he started to print, translations of the Bible, there was really not much the church could do to try and suppress it in the place where the printing press had become very widespread. Now, the next big schism to talk about is in Buddhism. So, in Buddhism, the big split there was between Theravada and Mahayana. And this is something that happened in a very sort of long-term fashion. And unlike the schisms in Christianity or in Islam, this wasn't really like a violent split or like or because of some like big argument or like vicious hatred between two groups or something. It just kind of happened as the religion sort of went in literally different directions. So it began in India, but there aren't many Buddhists in India now because it mostly didn't really catch on there, because like elites and the caste system didn't really trust it very much. But missionaries, Buddhist missionaries, took it out of India. So the earliest missionaries took it to Southeast Asia, to places like Thailand and Myanmar. And this is the version of Theravada that took root in those countries. And this is the type of Buddhism that's more of like a psychological program rather than a religion. Because the Buddha himself, he never taught about gods or the afterlife. He just never talked about that stuff. Basically, his point was, listen, we don't know what happens after, we don't know what happens when you achieve nirvana. We don't know if there's an afterlife. But all I know is that the world is defined by suffering. Here's how to get out of it. Go sit in a monastery and meditate. Have compassion for the suffering of others. Live a life of moderation, and detach yourself from the cares, from the things of the world that are trapping you in reincarnation. So Theravada then was more like a strict psychological program, and to really sort of do it properly and achieve enlightenment, you sort of had to be in a monastery to do it. So the way that it kind of works in countries that are still Theravada now, there will be monasteries where the monks live. And like the community around them will support them, will give them food, will beautify the monasteries, give gifts. But generally speaking, the people who don't live in the monasteries, they're not really considered to be like practicing Buddhists. They're just supporting the people who are the Buddhists. Now, as the religion spread along the Silk Road, though, going north out of India a little later on, and then into Tibet and into China, into East Asia, it kind of syncretized with religions that already existed in those areas. So that was the version that became Mahayana. And Mahayana, especially when it hit China, one of the big differences here is that there's more, they sort of adopted like Chinese views of the cosmos, and that there are gods and goddesses in nature that you can pray to help you achieve enlightenment. And they started to look at the Buddha himself as a god you could pray to for assistance in your path toward enlightenment. And so they started talking about an afterlife, a sort of blissful heaven that you would go to be with the Buddha. So it became a more sort of like religion-y religion. And it kind of syncretized with Taoism a little bit too. So Chinese Buddhist missionaries, they would talk about the Tao of the Buddha. Basically like the way of behaving that was required of you in order to achieve enlightenment. And the Tao in Taoism means the way of nature, like the flow of the universe. So they kind of combined the language and some of the ideas to make this new sort of religious version of Buddhism. And also then in Mahayana, it was more sort of possible to kind of just like do Buddhism as a religion. So even if you didn't live in a monastery, you could still pray to the Buddha to like give you good things and to protect you and to like bring you a good life. So it didn't necessarily require you to do like the really strict, like hardcore meditation and psychological stuff to be like part of the religion. So Mahayana then, it also split into, numerous different types of versions. So Zen is a version of Mahayana. And as it spread through China, it became somewhat popular as just a religion that people did, alongside being Confucianist or alongside Taoism. When it went into Korea and Japan, in Japan it sort of blended with Shinto, and it just became a religion that people did along with Shinto. And in Tibet, it actually became the state religion there. So, but once again, there's no conflict between Theravada and Mahayana. It's simply just different versions of this religion that developed as it went in different directions out of India. Now, finally, then, the last major schism was in Islam. So, Islam began in the Middle East in the 600s, right around the city of Mecca, which is now in the country of Saudi Arabia. And Muhammad, of course, was the guy who was the prophet, who had the revelations that eventually became the Quran. the basic teachings and beliefs of Islam. Now, once Muhammad died, though, while he was alive, he became a political leader, a guy who basically led the Islamic state that was developing in the Middle East under his leadership. But after his death, there was a dispute over who got to become the caliph, the successor to Muhammad, the guy who became the new leader of Islam after Muhammad, and could claim, to be the one defending and bringing the faith out to the world. So, this dispute then led to the first great schism in Islam. So, Sunni Muslims, they're the ones who believed that the person who was just the best leader among the Muslims at that time should become the caliph and lead, Islam as it expanded. But Shiites, though, Shia Islam, they believed that only someone related to Muhammad could become the next leader. So, in Shia belief then, they kind of had this attitude that some people, because they were related to Muhammad, were spiritually, a little more advanced and more qualified to be spiritual leaders as well as political leaders. Whereas Sunni Muslims basically had the attitude that, there was only one Muhammad. He's the last prophet. Now that the religion's out there, we just need someone to defend it. We don't need someone to be another prophet or a spiritual guide. We just need someone who's a good Muslim, who is a great political leader and military leader who can defend and organize and rule over Islam and bring it to the world. So, the split happens. And over a few decades, in the 600s, there's violence between the two factions. And ultimately, and also the particular individual that Shiites identified as the one that they wanted to become the new caliph, the leader of Islam, was Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali. So, even after Ali died, he was actually assassinated in 661, some of his other relatives became the guys who Shiites then sort of identified as the ones who we want to be in power. So Sunnis, though, kind of won this civil war, and they became the caliphs, and the great dynasties of caliphs, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, as Islam expanded across the Middle East and North Africa, they were Sunnis. And Shiites were always kind of there as this other sect that existed within the Muslim world, but they didn't really have power. Now, eventually, though, in the 1500s, the Ottoman Empire was based in Turkey, and they expanded to take over, Mecca and Medina. They took over Israel. They took over Egypt. They were a huge, powerful empire, but they were Sunnis. So in Persia, modern-day Iran, a new dynasty emerged there at the same time as the Ottomans, called the Safavids. Now, basically, the Ottomans were becoming the big Islamic empire of that time period, the 1600s. So the Safavids kind of created this sort of national identity for Iran as Shia Muslims. So they claimed divine right to rule by saying that they were the ones who were really like the proper caliphs, the true descendants of Muhammad, who had the right to rule over Islamic society. So they were constantly fighting wars against the Ottomans along their borders to gain control over territory, Sunni versus Shia. And as time went on, this kind of identity in Iran as the ones who are Shia, the ones who are the true leaders of Islam, became more and more reinforced and developed. So to this day then, this is a map of the modern Middle East and North Africa. Most of the countries that are Islamic are predominantly Sunni, whereas Iran is the only one that is really almost entirely Shia. And, in Iraq, I think it's about half and half, because that's right on the border of what used to be the Safavid Empire. And there are some Shias elsewhere in the Middle East, But for the most part, Sunnis are the majority of Muslims in the world, but Shiites are the majority of Muslims in a couple of particular countries. And now this kind of split between Sunni and Shiites is one of really the most like violent sort of ongoing conflicts in the world. Because in Iraq, there's a huge amount of like sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shiites. Iran, supports like Shia insurgents in Lebanon, and Syria, Yemen. So it is still this kind of ongoing dispute. So let's see. Now, I got a question here. Can you discuss empire building strategies used by the major empires and the reasons for the decline of empires? Once again, quick rundown, empire building strategies. Powerful, technologically advanced military systems, usually professional in some way. So they're just very well trained, very well equipped. Expansion, some claim to divine right, or at least something to justify that they are truly the ones who should be in power, whether it's communism or social Darwinism or nationalism or divine right, something to justify what they're doing. They usually have powerful centralized governments and bureaucratic systems that can carry out the orders of the person on top and like collect taxes and maintain order and so on. But usually though, if an empire is diverse, like the Ottomans or like the not the Byzantines, or like the Romans or like the Persians, there's usually some tolerance for local cultures. And in like the Spanish colonies in America, at some point they kind of like just had to deal with the fact that Native Americans were kind of holding on to their religion as well as becoming Catholic. Lucy. Sorry, the rain and thunder is driving them crazy. So, all right. So there was usually some toleration, but not too much if they wanted to like really kind of maintain very strong centralized government. They built infrastructure, public works projects. They promoted trade and production of goods. Basically, they wanted to make themselves look like they were the ones helping their people prosper, as well as defending their people from outside attack. And then for decline, there could be a succession crisis where there's like a dispute in the government over who actually gets to be in charge, which could lead to civil wars, which kind of like tear an empire apart from the inside. And then that leaves them vulnerable to invasion from outsiders. And if they start to break apart, that means less tax revenue to finance the government or the army, and it becomes kind of this cascade of problems that's really difficult to reverse and send in the other direction. So, now, another question here. Russia's claim as the third Rome. So once again, the Roman Empire was the first Rome. The Byzantine Empire was the second Rome. Russia, because they learned Byzantine religion and language, and they were building buildings in the style that the Byzantines had, with the domes and the arches. They started using the title Third Rome to describe themselves. And so after the Byzantine Empire was conquered by the Ottomans, then Russia was like, all right, we're now the Roman Empire. We're the ones who are just continuing the Roman system in state and religion. We're going to call ourselves Tsar or Caesar, and we are now Rome. So what a great empire we are. Now, I got another question here. Major lingua francas. So what that phrase means, lingua franca, is, well, it literally means the French language, but the way that it's used, though, it means any language that becomes very widely spoken, even outside of its original homeland. It just becomes like the language people use when they're doing business, like on an international stage. So, in the Roman Empire, Latin and Greek were the lingua francas of the Roman Empire, depending on which part of the empire you were in. In the Middle East, North Africa, and then around the Indian Ocean, as Islam spread during the post-classical era, Arabic became the lingua franca. And it developed into a bunch of different dialects, but the Arabic writing system became widely used around the Middle East, North Africa, West Africa, East Africa. In China, the type of Chinese language spoken by the scholar gentry was called Mandarin Chinese. And Mandarin, that was another word that was actually used to describe the scholar gentry. So because that was the language of government, of high-level business, that became the lingua franca in China. And actually then, let's see. So later on, though, as Europeans expanded in Latin America, which was taken over by primarily the Spanish language became like the primary sort of high-level language of all of the Spanish colonies in America, which is why, Peru and Ecuador and Chile and Mexico all speak Spanish. But in Portuguese colonies, it was Portuguese. In French colonies, in sub-Saharan Africa, French became the lingua franca. And in Canada, the area of Canada that was occupied by French became the language spoken there. But English, though, has become really the big lingua franca of the world, because the English, the sun never sets on the British Empire. To the late 1800s, early 1900s, English spread around their colonies as the major language of business. But then after World War II, based on American military and economic and political power around the world, English became really the global lingua franca. So in the United Nations, many of the deliberations there are in English. If you are just engaging in very high-level international politics or business, chances are you know some English. And in most of Europe, people just learn English as a second or third language when they're in school, because that's just the language you learn to do sort of international stuff. Okay, so are there any more questions, or can I, shut it down for the night? Gus, come on. All right. Gus. This is Gus. He's actually named Augustus. He's named after the first Roman emperor. So we'll call him Gus for short. All right. That's enough, Gus. Ugh. So, if there are no more questions, I'm going to shut it down for the evening. Thank you for all of your attention. Thank you for the good questions. And some of you I'll see in class tomorrow. And the rest of you, see, I guess, on Thursday. So if you got any more questions, shoot me messages on Remind, or come in to see me during my planning hour third period. Yeah, have a great night, everybody. I will see you all later.